It's after dinner at Beersheba Springs, Tennessee, a time that we often sit around and tell stories to each other and about each other. And this evening I've been asked by our friends Clopper and Joan Allman to talk about myself, something that I would do without invitation, but on this occasion it seems particularly appropriate to do so because we've had quite a year. My name is Dona Gower, Dona Spawn Gower. My beloved husband Herschel and I bought this cottage at Beersheba Springs in 1976, in part with the great encouragement of our daughter Allison, who was at that time 6 years old and who had fallen in love with Beersheba the summer before when we were given a house to live in for a month. And she learned to ride a bicycle and experience the beauties of this extraordinary place with its vegetation, its hills, its swimming holes, and all sorts of fascinating people, young and old. It's a place where my husband had been coming for many, many years with his good friend Isabel Howell, and also staying at the Charlie Mitchell Cottage, another famous place on this mountain. My husband and Herschel and I'll have to get to that in a moment, came to this place by rather circuitous ways. And it's about those ways that I'll be speaking this evening, because in a way, being at Beersheba Springs encapsulates the story of my life. I was born in Dallas, Texas. Would never have expected, with roots like that, to have ended up at Beersheba Springs, Tennessee. It took years for me to remember that my beloved grandmother, Dona McDonald, for whom I was named, had been born in Irving College, Tennessee, just a stone's throw down from our cottage view, and that Dona McDonald during World War I was a divorced woman with 2 small children working in a hosiery mill, who was spotted by a big Pennsylvania Dutchman named Luther Sidney Miller, and fallen in love with by him. She accepted his proposal of marriage. He took her and her 2 children with him, and they moved to Texas, where he would pursue a career as a roofer and then as president of the Roofers Union for many, many years before he died. My grandmother Dona never lost contact with her relatives at Irving College. In fact, one of her relatives was Judge L.D. Miller, who lived in Chattanooga and wrote detective stories. And I remember as a young child going to the drugstore with my grandmother, and she would pick up in the news rack true detective stories, and there would be a story by Judge L.D. Miller. There was an Aunt Nett that I remember talking to on the phone, and many, many others who faded in my memory as I grew older because my beloved grandmother, who raised me until I was 8 years old, died then, and I went to live with my mother and my stepfather. My mother, Pearl, otherwise known as Allie Pearl, a name my grandmother's oldest son, Marshall, gave her, never had much interest in family genealogy or where her roots were, and so she didn't talk about the Tennessee connection. It was many years later that I would learn just how connected I was and remain to Tennessee. But to have a little interstices in the story of how I came to be at Beersheba Springs in 2013, surrounded by people that I love in this remote and gorgeous location, I have to go back to my childhood again. My grandmother, as I said, raised me till I was 8 because I was born to Vance Carroll and my mother after a very short relationship in which they fell madly in love, got married, and were separated before I was born. So my grandmother took me and my mother in, but mother during the war enjoyed being a grass widow, as they were called, and she was out a great deal, having a wonderful time, and my grandmother's rule was that baby Dona got to go on date night with Mama every Friday. And so all during World War II, I was courted by handsome airmen and others who wanted to make an impression on my mother. I remember being given a silk parachute that was made into a dress for me, all kinds of souvenirs of the war, and being made a great deal of, made to feel beautiful and young and flirtatious, and also very, very smart. I had an aunt and uncle who lived with us who also took me. They had no children, so they took me to concerts. I got to see Jose Iturbi. I got to see Carmen Caballero. I went to the opera. I went to all kinds of wonderful places, all when I was a very little girl, because they had no children and wanted to take me places. So I got to be rather precocious because I was also an only child, and enjoyed the play of other adults. Therefore didn't get along terribly well with children, but grew up pretty quickly, only to be knocked off my heels when my sweet grandmother died, and I lost my grandfather and the surrounding support of my uncle and his wife, and suddenly went to live with my mother and my stepfather, who was in the military at the time and who thought this child had been badly brought up and spoiled and needed a great deal of discipline in order to be whipped into shape. So naturally, strong-willed and stubborn as I was, we didn't get along very well. And I yearned for the time that I could make my own life completely independent and stand on my own 2 feet. Well, I managed to graduate from a little Catholic high school named St. Edward Academy in Dallas. I had a valedictory scholarship, so I was able to go to the University of Dallas with my tuition paid for, and working the night shift at Kodak processing laboratory, where I could make enough money to pay for my tuition. I was able to, not for my tuition, excuse me, I got the tuition for scholarship, but to pay for room and board for my last 2 years when I decided I wouldn't take any more money from my mother and stepfather. I managed to get my undergraduate degree at that university, and thought at the time I started at UD that I wanted to be a diplomat, that I would go into the diplomatic corps and hopefully save the world. However, during the time I was at UD, I discovered through the wonderful teaching of Louise Cowan that literature was probably the best insight into human nature, and that poetry the best way of changing hearts than politics, perhaps. And so I changed my major and decided to focus on something like literature. And that was a major change in the whole direction of my life, because I had thought I would be an activist in the most obvious sort of way in a political arena, not in the realm of education. But it was a commitment that I was glad to make, and a commitment not to leave entirely the things that I loved in history and in politics, but to see them reflected over and over again in all the great works of literature from the time men first could tell stories or read and write. And that has made an almost religious commitment in my own life to pass on that love of poetry, of literature, that makes people understand who they are as human beings and what their relationships can be with other people in a way that might, just might, in some small way, change hearts, change minds, and perhaps a little bit change the world. In my youth, I thought it really would change the whole world. As I've grown older, I've had to learn to be satisfied with little changes, one-on-one, but nonetheless to believe that as long as any of us reads, as long as any of us studies the great works, that there's some hope for the planet, that we can remember who we are and what we've been called to do. So, as soon as I graduated from the University of Dallas, with the help of the Cowans, I got a scholarship to Vanderbilt University, where they had gone to graduate school, and where I was accepted into the PhD program. At the time that they asked me to go to Vanderbilt, they also called a professor there who had been in graduate school with them. His name was Herschel Gower. And they said very politely, "We're sending a graduate student to you. Would you please look after her for us?" Well, that was something of a fatal mistake on their part, because when I got there, a very gentlemanly, mature man, 22 years older than I, quite handsome, quite dashing, introduced himself and said that the Cowans had asked him to call on me. And from that point on, he escorted me, was kind to me, professorial in every way, polite, a Southern gentleman, so exasperatingly so that it made me think he just might be a possibility for a romantic interest. I had forsworn men, marriage, and all other such things, thinking that I would be an entirely independent woman, free to do her own thing, and not to have to put up with the things I had seen the women closest to me in my life have to put up with in unhappy marriages. So I was quite amazed that this man held me at arm's length, but gently by the elbow as he helped me into cars and over drainage ditches. After we had known each other for about a year and a half, he invited me, he said he was going to propose, and indeed, it took about 6 more months for him to get around to it. But the psychology that he used in saying that he was going to propose to me was very interesting, because I think he knew that my answer would have been no if he had asked for one at that moment. So he simply made me wait, and making me wait made me want to marry him, and to see all the qualities in him that I had begun to see without a lot of romantic interest, but simply of an intellectual, friendly, courtly way that grew and grew and grew the more I got to know him. I sometimes think of what the Indians say about the difference between Indian relationships and those in the West, when they say that in America you start out with a boil and you go down to a simmer. In India we start with a simmer and we go up to a boil. And I think that's how I felt about Herschel. It started with a simmer and went up to a boil. He was and is, in my imagination, the kindest and best of men. And I cannot account for what my life would have been had I not met him. I suspect I would have been a very driven woman, a woman who had successes, but who had not been softened by the kind of love and kindness that he offered so manifestly to me and to everyone that he knew. He said some years after we had been married, in a class that we were teaching together, ostensibly talking about William Faulkner and Faulkner's wife, Estelle, he quoted Faulkner as having said, "I loved her, I began to realize that I loved her not in spite of her faults, but because of them." And I was so taken with that I said later, "Herschel, what a wonderful quotation. I've never heard that before. Where did you find that in Faulkner?" And of course I learned pretty quickly that he had just made it up on the spot. And I realized that he was talking about me. And Allison and I have often laughed because she said, "You know, when my father dies, the only person who has ever thought that I was perfect will be gone." And I said, "And the only person who's ever loved me with all my faults will be gone." And that's the kind of man that he was. I make that little speech about Herschel because, as I said, as much as my conversion to literature changed my life, my association with him over 46 years of marriage also changed my life and made me see things in ways I would never have otherwise seen them. With his courtesy, he encouraged my courtesy. I'm a rougher diamond than he was. He was Southern and polished. I was Texas and full of the brashness of the frontier in many, many ways, with language like a sailor when he never said damn. And he nonetheless put up with me, softened me, and would occasionally nudge me and say, "Dona, there are ladies present." And I would have to say, "Well, that's fine, Herschel, but I'm from Texas." He was all things to me and to our daughter Allison, and his death in December has left us most bereft. But I'll have to tell you how he got us to Beersheba Springs, Tennessee. After we had been married since 1966, just about a little less than 10 years after we had been married, we came to Beersheba to this retreat because a friend had offered it to us for a month, and brought our daughter Allison with us. Here she learned to ride the bicycle, to do all sorts of things outdoors that she didn't have the opportunity to do when we were in a more structured daycare situation in Tennessee, in Nashville. and I fell in love with this wonderful spot. So much so that when our month came to an end, I kept asking, does anybody know of a place that might be for sale? At the time, I had just gotten my first full-time job as a faculty member at Harpeth Hall, a private college preparatory school. And my husband and I, because he had a professor's salary at Vanderbilt, were poor by most worldly standards, and we couldn't figure out quite how we could afford to buy a place at Beersheba, but he joined with me in believing that this would be something we would love and that our daughter would love, and would be a retreat that we could come to where we could write and think and also meet the many interesting friends that he had known since the late 30s and early 40s, when he had started coming here with Isabel Howell, a librarian and raconteuse par excellence, and with Mr. Charlie Mitchell, both of whom were associated with historic cottages here. So we had connections and contacts and friends who asked all over the mountain if they knew of a place where the Gowers might settle in a summer residence. And indeed, our next door neighbors at the time, or who were to be our next door neighbors at the time, Katie and Mary McConico, found us this place right on the bluff overlooking T'other Mountain, and told us that the couple who owned it never came. They had grandchildren in Florida who probably wanted them to be there, and so they said, I believe they'll sell. And nosy Mary McConico went next door and asked if they would sell, and indeed they said they would. So Herschel and I and Allison acquired this house in 1976 and began to furnish it quite gradually. It was furnished when we got it in early Naugahyde and in early salvage. Gradually, bits and pieces of furniture from our house in Nashville, from Herschel's mother's possessions when she had to go to a nursing home, came to settle in this place. And we began to say, with Isabel Howell, who at Nanhaven, her family cottage, said, now things can come to Beersheba, but they cannot leave. And so we began to leave things at Beersheba and realized we could not take them away. One of the things each of us left separately, of course, and together, would be our hearts, because this was the place we could always come together and be quiet or joyful with other friends, or if we didn't want to go swimming or see anybody, just say we don't want to do that. We want to just read, or we want to just sit here and be together. All during that hiatus from the 1966, when Herschel and I first married, to 1970, when Allison, our daughter, was born, after 4 years of our being together, having traveled in Europe, living in Edinburgh for a year. The highlight, I know, of our life in 1970 was the birth of this daughter, while I was in the midst of still trying to work on a PhD. I'd finished my master's but was working on a PhD, and she provided for her daddy the absolute light of his life. I told him at the time that I realized I didn't mind in the least bit playing second fiddle to this beautiful daughter, because to a woman who has not had a father or a stepfather who did not particularly like her, the best revenge of all was to have a husband who absolutely doted on this beautiful child, and the joy that I had in watching him and her together was one of the great, great things that I cherish always. And it didn't mean he didn't dote on me, it just meant that we both knew that we had something extraordinarily special in this little creation. And she toddled along with us when we traveled in Aix-en-Provence and went to England. Allison has laughed as Herschel and I have told stories of putting her in every nursery school we could find in Europe when we traveled, and of her beginning to be quite cosmopolitan at a very early age, so that when we would be having cocktail parties, Allison would be heard occasionally, barely able to reach the top of the table. I believe I'll have some of this, as she had a bit of pâté or a bit of a cheese ball or smoked salmon or something of that sort. She loved all good things and loved to have stories told to her. I read to her Mrs. Tiggy Winkle and all of the Beatrice Potter books, but her father told her extraordinary stories every night. A story usually based in reality, although, as he often said, never let never let reality interfere with a good story. So Allison and I are not entirely sure of every detail factually of the stories he told her of Murfreesboro Road and the people who lived there in those years, or of his own family life, or even of his recounting of the history of Beersheba Springs, Tennessee, because he loved to pump things up with interest and with humor, and we all benefited from the reality that his fictions brought to the world that we found ourselves surrounded by. So, Herschel and Allison and I became a threesome in our travels, and she was a partner with us in just about everything we did, including our love of literature, reading poetry together, talking. It gave me an insight into family life that I had never had before, since the families I had known had not been very close to one another. And we felt, I think, a very special closeness indeed. In any case, it was out of that closeness and of traveling together that by the time Allison was, as I say, 5, 6 years old, we found Beersheba and came here. Instead of traveling to Europe as much, we thought we could come to this place, only 96 miles from Nashville, and revive our spirits whenever we needed to do that. So, from 1996, I was trying to finish the dissertation. It took me 8 years to do it, with baby in hand and also a full-time job. But by 1998, I'd finished my dissertation. We had been in Leeds for a year, where Herschel was doing the Vanderbilt in Leeds program, and Allison had been in school at the Gledhow Lane School in Leeds, and learned to speak like a Yorkshire tyke while she was there. In fact, when I took her to the dentist one day, the dentist looked up in horror when Allison said, "Ears me mum," and said, "Madam, my parents sent me to Edinburgh to boarding school so that I would not grow up to sound like that." Allison did indeed sound like a little Yorkshire lassie, and her father recorded her and sent the recording around to friends at Christmas time so that they could hear her speaking about going to Bolton Abbey and telling other stories on her family, like we keep our socks on till they're stiff because we didn't have a good washing machine. In any case, we came back after that year in Leeds and my finishing the dissertation.
What was the dissertation?
My dissertation was on Thomas Hardy, the 6 major novels. So I was able to do research on Thomas Hardy when we were abroad, both in 1973 and in 1978. I went to Dorchester and all around the country where Hardy's novels are set. Absolutely beautiful countryside there. Reminds one a little bit of Beersheba Springs, Tennessee, and indeed the natives are very reminiscent of the kinds of people one meets in the mountain scenarios in Appalachia today. So we came back from our stay abroad, and my dissertation in hand, and my prelims, I mean not my prelims, but my defense passed, and Allison went to school again, this time in a Catholic school no, well, you were not in Catholic school then, were you? Yes, you were in a Catholic school. And eventually, when I went to Harpeth Hall full time, Allison went there for a year. But because at Harpeth Hall we had a new headmaster, after our beloved headmistress, Sam McMurray, took a job at Hockaday in Dallas, Texas, a lot of us fought against his attempts to lower the standards of the school, to turn us into a place where girls just went to get finished and get married to boys who went to Vanderbilt as pre-med or medical students and stay at home with their parents for the rest of their lives. Our girls were going to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and other schools besides Vanderbilt. And there was a push from the Board of Trustees to calm things down a little bit, that there were too many uppity women there encouraging these girls to do things that their parents didn't necessarily want them to do. Now, this was a very small number of people, but there was definitely an attempt when they hired a man to be headmaster who had been in the development office at Vanderbilt to bring things down. And so 10 of us, when he fired 3 teachers without cause, decided we would resign. And when we resigned from Harpeth Hall, it made the front page of the Tennessean, because that didn't happen in Nashville. And of the 10 of us who resigned, I think 7 of us had PhDs and 3 had other advanced degrees. So it got attention, even though we knew that boards stick together with boards and that we would stay resigned, and indeed we did. I realized at that moment, when we left Harpeth Hall, that my life had changed again, because I'd been there for 10 years, had loved what I was doing, had been able to have the freedom to teach passionately the great works, to have control over curriculum, to watch with delight the results in the girls that all of us taught together, and to see what could happen in a small classroom situation where people are encouraged to think independently and work very, very hard to excel. I still hear from some of the people that I taught that many years ago. And when we resigned from Harpeth Hall, my daughter Allison was somewhat traumatized, because she had only just started to school there. And she had liked it, but was going through a teenage rebellion at the time about what she should do with her life. Did she want to be academic or not? What was her role in all of this? Nonetheless, she was uprooted, because after my resignation there, Sam McMurray, who was then head at Hockaday, as I mentioned, asked me if I would like to come to Dallas to teach. And one of the great moments, I think, of recognition in my life came when my husband, who was 7 generations Nashville, insisted that he would come to Dallas with me. I had said, "Darling, I'll go to Dallas for a year to cool off. I don't want to meet board members here and say things that I might regret saying later. I want to get out of Nashville. You and Allison go to Beersheba, and I will go to Dallas." And Herschel said, "Dona, darling, we can't do that. People will think we're getting a divorce." So he insisted that he would come to Dallas with me. And indeed, that meant Allison had to go to Dallas too. Well, Allison said, "Mother dear, I think you're doing the right thing for you, but it's not the right thing for me. I need to stay right here in Dallas. You and Dad. I need to stay right here, in Nashville. You and Dad go on to Dallas." Well, that couldn't happen. So we dragged a 15-year-old teenager, very unhappy, with us to Dallas, Texas, along with a chorus of women chanting in the background at Vanderbilt and other places, "Herschel Gower will never leave Nashville." I was really taken at that time with what he was willing to do for me, so that I could carry on and go on. I had really thought at that time I would only stay for a year in Dallas just to cool off. But when it turned into an opportunity for me to head a newly formed Teachers Academy at the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, where with a grant from the Meadows Foundation, I would be able to set up programs for teachers in the classics to pass on to them the kind of knowledge that had meant so much to me and that I knew was at the basis of all good teaching, because the definition of our humanity that teaching is all about, and that all of the disciplines participate in and tend toward. Not just our humanity, of course, but our humanity in relation to the whole of creation. And so it was an opportunity not to be missed. And my beloved husband at that time, after I had been at the Institute for a number of years, I stayed there almost 10, and he was supportive in every way there teaching himself occasionally, working on his books. He wrote 3 or 4 books during that 10-year period in Dallas. Suddenly, I came to another crisis that he would help get me through, and that was when a certain amount of tension formed at the Institute between me and one of its founders, and one in which I felt that the work that I had been doing was endangered, and I felt that I needed to leave and start an organization devoted entirely to the work with teachers, not one that had multiple prongs as the Dallas Institute did, which seemed to suck energy away as well as funds from the work that we did with teachers. So at that time, I talked with my husband and with Allison, and with some soul searching, he agreed 100% that I could leave and try to start my own foundation. That was a great sacrifice for him to make, especially because Herschel, with all of his wonderful people skills, he had been able to survive all kinds of regime changes at Vanderbilt, all sorts of terrible things, and was able to go into his classroom and teach and do wonderful things in spite of it. But he knew that I was more political than he, that I couldn't keep my mouth shut, and that I needed to speak out. And so he said, do it. And in fact, we had sold our house in Nashville, and he allowed me to use some of that money to help with the startup funds for the new Athena Foundation, which is what we called this organization that was named for a goddess who is a great mentor of heroes. And that's how we see teachers, as heroes, and how we see teachers' obligations to be as people who bring out the heroism in the children that they teach, the heroism that allows people to lead their own lives, the heroism that allows them to make decisions that may not be easy on the surface, but that they can navigate through Scylla and Charybdis and other difficult monsters that can encounter them in life, and come out on the other side of it, perhaps wounded, but at least instructed and better able to deal with the next crisis. Or indeed, if die they must, that they will die well. So it's been a wonderfully heroic kind of feeling that we've had as a little family over these last 25 or 30 years when we've been trying to work with other teachers and work in the world. My husband, when we started the Athena Foundation, now in its 17th year, became unretired and had to start teaching again and become the beloved old man figure, an old man of beauty and mystery and many, many stories to the hundreds of teachers that we have taught, and who, when he died last December, about 250 or so of the teachers and people that we had come into contact with came to pay tribute to him at the funeral mass and stay afterwards to say what a wonderful man he was. And so I cannot come to the end of my life without saying that his accompanying me that far in all of the journeys I've had, as well as my having accompanied him, has been a greatly joyful life, and has given me a sense of the purpose of everything I've ever read and learned, insofar as what we can read and learn teaches about what it is to love and be human in the world. And I guess that's enough of a biography for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dona.
Well,